Senator Lee Perry from Perry, a member of the House of Representatives here, and just want to get your input because we get a lot of things from the media talking about HB 148 that we passed here and that I helped co-sponsor in the state dealing with our federal lands and what your position is. I kind of know what your position is, but I'd like you to share with the people what your position is on the state of Utah's efforts to take those federal lands back that we feel like are really ours to begin with.
Yeah, well, thank you, Perry. And thanks for your great efforts in the state legislature. We have a great state, and we're fortunate to live in a state that's as well managed as ours is. I wish on a regular basis that we could exchange our legislature in Utah for the legislature that operates in Washington and our chief executive for theirs. We'd be much better off. So the legislature this year, with your help, thank you for doing that, started a debate that really needs to happen, a debate that's been destined to happen in many ways ever since our statehood. When we became a state in 1896, we did so pursuant to a Statehood Enabling Act that contained certain promises, certain expectations. We were told that the land that was owned by the federal government, that came into federal ownership during the time that we were a territory, that federally owned land within the state's boundaries would be sold. It would be sold perhaps gradually over a period of years. But we were told in Section 9 of that enabling legislation, in effect, 5% of the proceeds of the sale of the federal unincorporated land within the state's territorial boundaries, comma, which shall be sold subsequent to statehood, comma, shall be held in trust for the benefit of Utah's school children. So some say that this amounts at least to an implicit promise that the federal government would sell that land. Others have said that it's not implicit, it's explicit. Regardless, that was the plan. That was the plan that they had followed in other states, and they followed through on the plan in a lot of other states. But here we are. You know, we're, 116 years after statehood, and still 2/3 of our land is owned by the federal government. Reminds me of a song by the Scottish rock band, The Proclaimers. I can't understand why we let someone else rule our land. We have to engage in this endless sequence of Mother May I's to do anything on land within our state, to develop oil and natural gas, to engage in recreational activities, to access certain federal roads that we need to access in order to get to homes or ranches or farms. And it really is a problem. But even more striking is the problem that comes about as a result of the fact that we can't tax that land, and the entity that holds it prohibits people from engaging in a lot of economic activity on that land. So it stifles economic growth. It cuts down on our tax base, and this is one of the main reasons why we're dead last in the nation in terms of per student school funding. If you think about it, if any one person or any one entity, say a corporation, owned more than about 5% of the land in our state or in any state, people would be really nervous, justifiably, because that person or that corporation could control a lot of the state's economy by virtue of holding 5% of the land. Now, you would imagine that people would become even more concerned if they acquired 10% of the land, or 20, or 40, or 50, or 60% of the land. When they get to the point where they own about 2/3 of it, you get really panicked because they can dominate that state's economy. And then it gets that much worse than that when that person or that corporation suddenly declares, by the way, I'm non-taxable. I consider myself a sovereign. You can't tax me. You can't tax my land. Then you can allow that land to sit vacant. So what the state legislation, which I applaud, does is it says, look, at some point, the federal government needs to fish or cut bait. It needs to decide whether it's actually going to comply with this implicit promise made in our statehood enabling legislation. If it chooses not to comply, then we're going to start taxing it, even though our Statehood Enabling Act says that we won't. The fact that we said we wouldn't presupposed that they would comply with their end of the deal. So once that land is declared subject by a sovereign state to taxation, and the state legislature hasn't itself voluntarily relinquished that sovereign right, it changes the whole game. This, I believe, needs to be accompanied by action in Congress, which is not likely to occur while the Senate's under the control of the Democrats, but is likely to occur as soon as Republicans retake the majority, which I think we're going to do this year, where we have a robust discussion about the fact that we've got to start paying those states where a lot of federal land is held the full tax-assessed tax base equivalent of what we would be paying if we were a non-sovereign landowner. This, in and of itself, this more than any other thing will do more to influence federal land management policy than any other thing I can think of. Because at that point, if they have to pay the full taxable amount, if they have to pay the full tax that they would owe if they were not a government, then all of a sudden they have a really big incentive either to allow more economic activity on that land so that they can afford to pay for it, for the tax, or they need to sell it, or they need to transfer control over to the state. This is going to take time, but I'm thrilled that the legislature and the governor have taken this important step, and I thank you for doing that.